and welcome to 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. I'm your host, Rachel Vogel, and joining me on tonight's episode is Todd Tescher, Head of Digital and Commercial Partnerships for Glassnote Records. With a decade of experience, Todd has navigated the complex intersection of music, technology, and commerce from both a major label and independent perspective. In his current role, he spearheads global streaming and digital campaigns for a phenomenal roster of artists, including Mumford Sons, Phoenix, and Aurora. His strategic and innovative approach have not only elevated the visibility and success of these artists, but have also forged lasting partnerships with major streaming and digital platforms. So, Todd, pleasure to have you on the podcast. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super stoked.
Glad to hear it. Well, with that, are you ready to dive into the first question?
I am.
Let's do it. Imagine for a second you're sitting down with your 25-year-old self. What one piece of advice would you like to give him on a personal note, and what one piece of advice would you give him from a business perspective?
On a personal note, I think mine's pretty simple. I'm a firm believer that all things start with you. And so I think something that I would tell myself personally from when I was 25 is just really work and to truly be comfortable in your own skin and own who you are. I think be good for you before you can be good for others or anything else. And that includes your work and career, and family, friends, of course, and everything else. But I think make sure that you have all facets of your life, together and you have your intentions aligned. That's what I'd probably tell my 25-year-old self. And then kind of that leads in, I think, to what I would tell myself professionally. I think in our industry, especially when you're young and 25, you're always you look up to certain executives or people that you work for, and there's a tons of events and experiences and award shows and album release parties, and the list goes on. And so I think I would tell myself, keep your eye on the prize. Like, what is your intention with really being here? Like I said, especially when you're younger, super easy to just get wrapped up in those things and making sure you're getting invited to network. And like sometimes I think I would tell my 25-year-old self, stay focused on the work. Not that I wasn't, but stay focused on the work, because the truth is over time, the novelty of all these parties and events and all these things wear off. And now all I truly care about, which I did then too, but that's all I care about now, is just the work that our team puts out, what we're producing, how are we partnering with our artists, and are we really telling their stories the right way? How are we presenting this to our partners, and are we giving them a fair chance to understand what we're trying to accomplish? And these are the things that keep me up at night, not did I get an invite to the Spotify Best New Artist Party. As much as I would love to go and as much fun as that was, that's not what I'm thinking about. So I think that would be my advice to my 25-year-old self.
I think that's great advice. I do think that it is so easy to get wrapped up, especially early in your career, of like, oh my God, this one meeting that I miss is going to be the meeting that ends my whole career. But it's
Totally. And I
not.
think exactly. And I think you hear a lot of the times, like, especially I started in the major label system. And I think when you start in those systems where it's very clearly ranked, like coordinator and managers and directors, you start with this almost class, if you will, of like coordinators. And if one gets invited to an event, like, why didn't I get invited? And da da da. And you start like all of that is focus on the work. And I think that's what I meant when I said focus on the work is it's great to network, don't get me wrong, and to be at these events and learn and be a sponge. But if you put in the work, all of those things will happen for you.
100%. I'd be curious to know when you were starting out, was what you envisioned your like dream job being what you kind of have ended up in, and or how has that shifted over the years?
Oh, wow. That's a really good question. I think I just wanted to work in music. And to be honest, I was just so passionate about being on the business side of it and finding a way to fuse those two. And I don't even think I understood really what I wanted to do, but I just wanted to be in the music business. So I think I went in kind of not having any expectation, just excited to be part of the business. Um, so I don't I think it lives up to since I didn't have any expectations, it lives up to everything and more because it truly has been a blast.
That's awesome. All right, moving to the next question. Every industry has its dirty little secrets, and you and I both know that's no different in the music industry. But sometimes people think that's a bad thing when maybe that's not always the case. Sometimes they can be good. So, what's one secret you would like to share with our listeners about the industry?
For me, I think like in the media and generally speaking, especially people who are not diving into the music industry and looking at music business worldwide and like our kind of specific periodicals and stuff like that, I think the narrative that we always see is like record label versus the artist or artist versus the record label. And yes, of course, I think whenever you are at that intersection of like monetizing art, you're always, or no matter what the medium, like things can get interesting and tension will always form, and rightfully so usually. But I think the one secret, if you, I don't know if it's really a secret, if you will, but I guess I would want to share is some of the best parts of my job are spending time with our artists and actually building strong, really strong personal relationships with them. And like the label staff and artists usually form friendships and bonds. It's not always exactly what it seems. I think there are definitely, and understandably so, tensions that exist at a higher level, but from the staff and the way they're interacting with the artists and their teams, usually more often than not, there's a lot of collaboration and just at least that's very much so my experience on the independent label side for what I've been doing for the last handful of years. And yeah, I think ultimately, like the secret there is like, it's not even a secret, it's just human connection. Like, I think it's so important to understand people, their art, their work, and like quite literally how they're trying to use their voice. And that is so important to the strategy. It informs so much. And yeah, I guess the secret is not all labels and artists have contentious relationships, disagreements, and things, of course, come up, but that's in any business relationship. And I just think it's the special moments that people don't get to see that the label folks have with the artists that are so meaningful and really ultimately drive the project. So, for example, like and I'm in a foreign country on a promo run with a rock band, and it's like them stopping the Uber abruptly in between meetings to get tattoos. And it's like, well, what are they getting tattoos? It's like the first letter of their daughter's name because the lead singers are married. And it's like understanding so much more. It's like, oh, that's why they mentioned this in that song, or sitting in an Uber in between meetings and talking about like this one lyric in the album focus track and like really understanding what that means, not just, oh, it's the main track that we're going to focus on album release. Like there's actually an art and a meaning behind all that. So yeah, I guess the secret is a lot of the times people at the label becomes friends with the artists and their crew and their teams. It's not always this like record label versus the artist kind of thing that you see. Although when you do see it, I'm sure there's usually a reason behind it that's very valid.
Very true. I'm glad that you bring up like the relationships that you've had with the artists and the different types of campaigns that you work with. Because one of the other questions I wanted to ask you is, you've worked a number of campaigns across so many different genres from like pop and rock and country and all the above. Is it kind of like a different process how you approach these artists and these different projects based on the genres? Or is it you go into it with the same mindset and like open to the same, I don't know, the same steps, I guess?
I think inherently because there's a business aspect to what we're doing, each genre, there are some steps that you might take a little bit differently or handle things a little bit differently based on that genre. So like Latin versus like an all indie band, like inherently the way those spaces just work are a little bit different. But ultimately, I think kind of what I said before, it just boils down to human connection. So I think going in with an open mind, not being judgmental, creating a safe space for your artists, and really just understanding like who they are, what they stand for, things they're passionate about, anything from, the communities that they're a part of, the things that outside of music and aside from their craft, like what do they do, and just getting to know them as people, I think is the most important thing.
Moving along to the final question. Throughout your career, I can only imagine that you've been asked plenty of questions, whether it was for an industry conference, the media, or even a promotion. But throughout all of those interviews and all of those questions, there has to be one that you've never been asked but would have liked to. So, what is that question and what would be your answer?
So because I can't stop talking about strong relationships with artists, how does your relationship with your artists inform your work? And why I would like to be asked that is I think that a lot of the time we focus on, and as we should, data and virality and skip rates and if people save to collection and all these things, which of course are important and also inform the strategy and need to be taken into account. But I think for a second, sometimes you need to pause and forget which playlist you logged in, or if you have a billboard for release date, and the list goes on. And to kind of tie back to all my previous responses, just like go back to the basics, which is the artist and their art and what is the, and like my answer to that is, I guess, I think it's so important to truly understand the person or people that you're working with as much as possible to amplify their voice, message, music, art, in a way, I guess, more so that resonates with the way they've set out to go and release this piece of art and their story into the world. And I think a lot of people forget that this isn't just a business like process. Like it's not a manufacturer. Like this is someone's story. It's very vulnerable. We have an artist who recently put out an EP that's entirely about her relationship blowing up and calling off an engagement, and just it's the lyrics are true and to her and her experience, and that's so vulnerable to open up your experience like that to such a critical world. And so I think having that strong relationship with the artist and their team allows them to feel more comfortable during this process, and it takes away that businessy part of it for the artist, but ultimately allows our teams and the teams at the labels to like understand the project on a personal note so they can kind of dive in, ideate, and strategize a campaign that tells the story correctly and engages with the fans and the listeners in a really authentic way that ultimately is in line with the intentions of the artist and their work. So, like, this is when the magic happens and worlds are created and experiences are thought of. And this is like the fun moments in the conference room when we really understand an artist and what they're trying to create or share or tell. We can come up with the most exciting things and bring them to our partners and create the most exciting and amazing experiences for their fans or new listeners. And I think, yeah, that's a question I wish people would focus on and ask more frequently in panels or interviews and stuff like that.
That's a great question. Before we close it out, can you share a little bit about, as somebody who started within the major label system and then made the jump to the independent side, what has been kind of the biggest upside and downside that you've seen from both?
So I think there's pros and cons to both. I think obviously the majors are machines. They are, built and ready to go, and it's a little bit more plug and play. But I think the biggest thing I've learned is that's a hard question, but I've learned so much. And I think the indie side is a little bit more personal than the major label side. I think even as an employee, I felt like more of a name on the indie side than a number. And even going back to what I said before about label versus the artist and stuff, I could understand more on the major side how maybe that same sentiment might apply sometimes. But I think what I learned a lot was it's not always about like being signed to the biggest label with the biggest name and the biggest budget and the biggest ad spend and the best person on your radio promo. Like you can have all those things and that's great. What I've learned is I would rather work with a team that's scrappy and can roll their sleeves up. And like, yes, I oversee all of our streaming and digital and commercial partnerships, but I can tell you I most definitely have worn and happily other hats that's not my job, but that's also given me the opportunity to learn a new part of this industry or just another part of what a record label provides. And even though that's out of my forte or whatever, like it's just so cool to be you just really get to see every single part of the process go down. Like I've never been a part of putting together of I always am on the digital side. So for example, we're in the middle of putting together a physical offering right now for that will roll out with one of our albums. And I've never been so involved in understanding on what actually has to happen for a vinyl to be produced and distributed and get out and for it to get into someone's hands. It's a really lengthy process. And you actually have to like really know what you're talking about just the same way you do on the digital side. Like, and so, yeah, I think the exposure, that's what it is. It's the exposure to the entire process and experience, and it's not being boxed into one department or role or job or task. It's really being able to raise your hand and say, that's not my job, but I know someone who knows someone. So let's figure this out. And we may not have the budget for it like a major, but we can get a brand sponsor here, and because this makes sense with this lyric in this song. So it drives creativity because you can't just pull, dollars out of your wallet and throw it at something. You have to really cultivate it and just grassroots efforts. So
That's really cool. Awesome. Well, it's about time we close out this episode, but Todd, thanks again for joining me. Loved having you on the podcast.
thank you so much for having me. And again, this is just so awesome what you're doing. So kudos to you.
Thank you. And to everybody listening, hope you enjoyed tonight's episode. Stay tuned for next week of 3Q, where I interview industry professionals for just 15 minutes by asking three powerful questions. See you next time.